Good morning, everyone. Today we'll begin talking about our last topic for this semester, talking about modern technology. Before we get to that, I want to just do one thing with you. In addition to the link to today's uh, video, let me enlarge that for a second. I'll also send you a document which provides, and this is what you see on the screen at the moment, provide some details about the way that I'm going to grade and assess your final project. So there is here details, different criterias for the different sections of the final paper, a total of 100 points, of course. And then there are the details for the different sections for your presentation. In this case, it's going to be a total of 10 points. What I want you to think about when you use this document, I prepared that in advance on purpose so you'll have time to also look at that while you're writing your paper. And as it says here, in order to get those points, you need to make sure that you address the details in your sections, right? So you present the topic. For example, in your introduction, what are you talking about in this research project? And it's going to be great if you're able to find a motivating case or a motivating story to explain us why should we study this topic. Addresses things like research question, then explain why it's important to study this research. And you end the introduction by providing a brief description of what was the theory that you relied upon, what kind of tests you ran, and what were your main findings. That has to be, it states here brief on purpose because it has to be brief, such as 2-paragraph tops. And then you have the details regarding the review of the literature. So tell us a little bit, what does the literature that exists on this topic already have given us evidence and arguments for? I would ask you to use at least 3 different articles. When you go for books, you can go for books, but use 3 different, so read at least 3 different articles on the topic that you're studying. That's going to provide you the details that you need in order to understand the topic, and it's also going to help you clarify the question for yourselves. As I told to some of the students that came to office hours and asked for my help when it comes to building a research question. Then, of course, you have the different points here that I'm going to provide you regarding the theory. The most important part for the theory section is how does the theory help explain the question that you're trying to answer? How do the different theoretical arguments explain that? The empirical test, I gave you the details here for those of you that is going to use case studies, historical cases to illustrate your theoretical arguments. If you, as the note here at the beginning of page 2 says, if you're using data, so it's quantitative data to run statistical analysis, I would encourage you to contact me and meet me in office hours so we can talk exactly how I'm going to do the grading for this section. And the last section is summary of the results. What you found, how does that fit with the existing research, the implications that it has for the theory as well as the policy, and also, because no research project is perfect, what are the limitations of your research, right? Similar way, you should think about the presentation. Few points that I mentioned here: try to minimize the amount of text, not a lot of text in your slides. It's much better to use pictures and figures than to use text. However, when you do use text, make sure that you're able to use terms that it's gonna make it easier for me to understand what you want to talk about in your intro, in your theory or conclusion. So if you're talking about military coercion, you're talking about motivations for terrorism, then one of the terms you can use is costly signal. Of course, you have to provide some context, but when it comes to the presentation, using those kinds of terms is very, very important. All right? So if you have any questions about that, as always, you are more than welcome to come talk to me about this to office hours. And that's the second point I want to mention for today. Let me just put the screen here. Not this one. There it is. Come to office hours if you need more help regarding your final project. I'm sure that those that came to office hours thus far were able to get my help, and I hope that I was able to actually help them with their project. So that's just my a couple of points before we begin to talk about today. Just a quick review. Over a Thursday meeting, we talked about the second part of the terrorism discussion, focusing on the different effects. So I talked about political effects in the context of terrorism. How does terrorism affect voting? The two different mechanisms, the retrospective voting or the valence theory, providing you evidence both from Israel and Spain. Israel was focusing also on the effects when I talked a lot more about the rockets threat in Israel. Then the psychological effects of terrorism, how that leads to psychological reactions such as anxiety or threat. How does threats of terrorism affect the debate between national security policy and civil liberties? We talked about that. And then we switched and talked more about counterterrorism overall, talking about different tools when it comes to hard power, the different approaches, indiscriminate or discriminate approach for hard power, the effectiveness question, which is the most important question that the research has been, or I don't know if the most important, but the question that most researchers are dealing with, and then talking about soft power, which seems to be more promising in terms of effectiveness, but it has its own list of limitations. And then we use the three theoretical approaches to explain counterterrorism policy. So if you want to talk more about this topic, you have any other questions, you can email them to me or come as usual to office hours. Okay, so for today, the topic we address is the intersection of advancement in technology, in the sense of mostly military technology, and how it shapes international relations, especially conflict. So we're going to talk more about these kinds of technological advancements, and we're not going to talk about this technological advancement because, you know, it doesn't fit to what we're talking about here. So the first question we can think about is, why should we care about military technology? We already know that military power is essential to the conduct of warfare. And many of the different theories that I've talked about in this course so far, whether it is neorealism, realism, the aspects of deterrence or coercion, most of those theories rely on the application of power in the sense of military power in order to explain events in the international system. Now, maybe another aspect that we can think about is how states use those military tools. And this question relates to different strategies, and that also speaks on some level to coercion strategies. It also relates to force deployments, routines and procedures that different organizations are implementing, those kinds of things. And that's a different way to think about technology. Now, one way to understand the role technology plays in this context is to think about the acquisition of weapons. So studies in this context have focused on using domestic institution, leader attributes, strategic concerns such as status or reputation. They use all those kinds of factors, which we already talked about in this course earlier, to explain why, or to explain the decision to obtain different types of weapon systems. So in that sense, those kinds of studies have looked at the military technology as a dependent variable, the variable that we're trying to explain. Now, the research has tried to add the aspect of using that technology itself as an explanatory factor. So the technology becomes the independent variable. This is the factor that explains certain behavior in the context of international relations or conflict, such as how does that explain deterrence, how that explains war outcomes, how that explains the results of crisis bargaining. So the independent variable, the explanatory factor in our models is military technology. So this is where the research is attempting to go right now, but it faces a lot of limitations, especially in two aspects. One is a relatively limited exposure to the technology itself. So we know that there's a lot of those kinds of tools relate to stuff such as drones, which we're going to talk about a lot today. But there's a lot more newer types of technologies which are beyond drones, such as robotics, and the whole area of robotics, in which research when it comes to social sciences as a whole and political science particularly is still lagging behind. We don't have the access to understand and to learn more about those technologies. The other point is that there's a relatively still high degree of uncertainty regarding how those kinds of weapon systems affect war behavior or war conduct. Also because the evidence that we have for the use of those kinds of systems is still limited. Still, scholars do not view those limitations as reasons not to engage in those kinds of research. So to overcome them, they adopt several approaches. For example, one solution is using a direct approach, which focuses on the measurement of attitudes regarding the use of advanced technology by leveraging research designs such as surveys and experiments to explore different questions. So we add questions to the public, which, as I told you already several times, is the easiest type of customers for those kinds of studies to use. But it also relates to collecting the attitudes of elites and military officials to learn more about their attitudes in that sense. Another solution is to use existing data on conflicts and add those new tools into this existing research. For example, how does the use of drones shapes the war in Afghanistan? How does the use, and we talked about it a little bit last week when I talked about counterterrorism, how does the use of cyber tools adds or affects existing conflicts? We'll talk about cyber today. A third approach applies existing IR theory to the limited evidence that we do have about technologies. For example, how does AI, which is the acronym for, for artificial intelligence, fit into theories such as balance of power? And the fourth is based on a formal theory, and that is leveraging the advantages of models of game theory, which provides a very simple representation of reality and interactions between actors in order to derive predictions about their expected behavior. And now applying that in the context of new technology and using the limited amount of cases that we do have to test those kinds of expectations. So that's what we're trying to do now. The first topic I'm going to talk about a little bit in more detail is in applying this logic of emerging technologies into the concept of escalation. The emergence of new military technologies led many policymakers and professionals to argue that it won't take a lot of time until it's going to have a negative effect when it comes to escalations in war. So, for example, we have here a quote from the Center for a New American Security, which is one of the big think tanks in Washington, arguing that new technologies changing the way deterrence and escalation operate in a potentially dangerous ways. So the possibility of escalation is higher because of new technologies. A former undersecretary in the Defense Department argued that emerging new military capabilities such as cyber, military defense, autonomous systems, increasing the uncertainties in the environment, and create slippery slope of escalation. So again, this is just examples for the way that professionals and politicians view the effects of those technologies. And this is important to think about it because this is the effect of the new technology on the potential of conflict escalation. Another angle, view these tools not as an independent factor that creates the incentives for escalation, such as those quotes provide as an example, but rather it views them as an additional factor, a complementary one that contribute to wars. In that sense, political decisions and strategic strategies are the main factors that drive the escalation of conflict, and the new technology only complements that. Which means that overall we have two approaches to think about how technology affects escalation of war. One is just like this, those quotes have given us, it's a strong causal effect. So emerging technologies can cause different types of escalation because they emphasize the advantages for what's called the first movers. Once you have that technology, you have advantages to operate or to execute an attack first. And we can think about it in the context of the security dilemma. If I have this technology and my rival doesn't have it, I have incentives to use that before the rival is able to obtain that technology and then create a balance of power. That's part of the security dilemma. The second effect is the complementary role. That's a weak intervening role. And that's viewing technology as a tool that enables states to engage in deliberate escalation after they've already made the decision to escalate the conflict. So the decision has been made based on political considerations or strategic settings or conditions, but the technology allows to execute the attack in a more, maybe in a better way. So they serve as an intervening variable in the entire escalation process. So I'm talking about that based on the work by Professor Talmadge. She's a professor at the University of Georgetown, which has a lot of research in this context about military technology and how it affects different concepts of IR, such as deterrence and escalation. And she offers different types of escalation in the context of our discussion here. For example, there's vertical escalation, which is a shift in the level of violence that is beginning to target civilians in addition to military targets. It should be defined as a very severe type of escalation because it violates or crosses a very clear threshold, which leads to more casualties. It usually prolongs the war and raises the stakes. Another type of escalation where military technology can have an effect is what can be viewed as an inadvertent type. And that's based on wrong estimates due to failure to appreciate the pressures that one's action places on the opponent. Think about it again, just like I talked about in the previous slide, in the context of the security dilemma. The first mover's advantage, in the fact that if I have the tools, or for that matter, even if we think about it, I'm country A. In country B, I know that my rival, I have information that country B is almost ready to have a very advanced type of weapon systems. It provides incentive for me, from the context of strategic incentives, the security dilemma, maybe to attack first in order to ensure that my rival does not have full advantage in that sense because the rival was able to develop that technology. So that's inadvertent escalation. And that's exactly the point here, that in this context, new technologies change the offensive-defensive balance based on these advantages for first movers and escalation of the conflict. Lastly, we have an intended type of escalation. In that sense, we developed the tools and leveraged them to manipulate the escalation risks and implement military strategies. And the main difference in this case is that the technology serves in order to amplify or to enhance a decision that's already been made to escalate the conflict, and does not serve as an incentive by itself. Technology is not the reason, just like the quotes told us, it's not the reason for escalation. It just enhances that decision, which is a political decision. So in order to test those different arguments, she goes to test a couple of historical cases, and she actually goes all the way back to the war in Vietnam and looks at the development of the new technology at the time, which were laser-guided bombs. And overall, what she shows in her case studies is that the evidence suggests that the technology development served as a complementary, and the escalation decisions throughout the war, when it comes especially to the aerial campaigns, were driven by political and strategic decisions or incentives. In that case, the technology of the smart bomb technology in the latter phases of the war enabled a better execution of the aerial campaign. It wasn't the reason for the aerial campaign. So first, she looks at the campaigns during the Johnson administration from 65 through all the way through 1968 to the year of the elections. And she shows and provides evidence that the types of the objectives and the targets that were a part of the aerial campaign kept being more and more, it went through more of an escalation process. It began from targeting industrial assets in order to create some kind of deterrence factor, to focusing on military targets, which is a more direct, coercive type of strategy, all the way to targeting infrastructure in order to pressure the public. And she provides various types of evidence that technology served as actually was a non-factor. It was almost non-existent because development was still lacking. The technology itself was not there. And it has a critical effect on the aerial campaign, because one of the problems of that campaign was the fact that it required a lot of sorties. So that's a lot of different attacks by a different part of the Air Force to actually destroy the targets that they were intended to hit. So essentially, they used multiple attacks were unable to hit the targets because of precision problems. So that's the first part of her test. Then she focuses on aerial attacks during the Nixon administration, focusing mostly on the 1972. And in that sense, the technology advancement that was used is the laser-guided bombs. But her evidence suggests that it mostly served to enable what she views as a horizontal type of escalation, which means there is the attacks focusing on new types of targets. Those targets were not available before the technology was there. You were unable to attack them. So once you have that laser-guided bombs, it was possible to attack them. But when she talks about the main escalation during that time, and that's the Christmas bombing during December of 1972, technology was not a factor because first of all, the main reason is that the Christmas bombings were executed using the heavy B-52 bombers, which do not rely on this technology. So that provides additional evidence that the new technology enabled different types of attacks. It was not the driver of the overall escalation, based, once again, as I said, on strategic and political incentives. So that's the general effect that technology can play. And that's one way to look at the way that at the possibilities of applying this research area into existing knowledge that we have in IR. Now I want to focus on a type of technology that I'm sure you're familiar with in one way or another, and that's the military drones technology. It's the most prominent type of technology that's being studied by researchers in foreign policy, in IR, in military sense. It discusses remote piloted vehicles, which has both launch and landing capabilities. And important characteristics of those tools is the ability to use for multiple types of operation, what's called repeated use. It's a prevalent tool of counterterrorism policy for many countries. For the Americans, it is a prevalent tool used in the theaters of war in Central Asia, mostly Pakistan and Afghanistan. Also in Iraq, it was used, in Yemen. And it's by far, from a research standpoint, the most dominant subfield of inquiry is the questions of effectiveness. We talked about it a little bit when I talked about counterterrorism last week. And now I want to talk about it a little bit more in details. So first, we can think about all the different advantages. It's a lot more efficient tool, starting from the development of the laser-guided bombs way back in Vietnam, all the way to the most advanced types of drones we have today, a greater degree of accurate targeting using those tools. Second, and which relates to that, is the idea of cost effectiveness. It mitigates the risk of life for putting soldiers on the ground. We don't need to use a Marine squadron in order to target rebels' compound. We can do that with those kinds of drones and not risk the soldiers. The accuracy also reduces the extent of civilian casualties, which is a very important aspect when we think about using drones in dense populated areas to target rebels, terrorists, all kinds of adversaries. The technology today is that advanced in terms of precision that those drones are able to put the missile that they're using to target their adversaries through a very small window and hit a very specific floor in a multi-story building. That's what the accuracy provides us in terms of efficiency and cost effectiveness. The third point where it provides advantages is the fact that it can stay in the relevant mission area for long periods of time, allows to collect more information, more intelligence, track more movement, and all the things that I talked about when I talked about the multi-purpose use of drones when it comes to counterterrorism. And again, using that research that I talked about last week, it's some of the evidence from Central Asia, some of the drone campaigns around the world show that those uses of those kinds of tools of technology is efficient in terms of decreasing additional attacks and lower risk for reprisal by terror groups. At the same time, there's a lot of research that shows the other point. There's a lot of negatives to the use of drones, and there's a lot of criticism. First, arguing that blowback is very likely, because a lot of those attacks by the drones that we're talking about, in many sense, are using inaccurate intelligence, which creates a lot of damages beyond the specific targets. And the successful type of attacks are based on good intelligence, which in many of those cases come from human resources or human sources on the ground. And that suggests that technology serves only a complementary role because the information itself comes from the agents on the ground. And the technology only serves to implement the attack. So that's one point. The other point is that despite the alleged success of those attacks, terror groups led by Al-Qaeda and other types are still able to engage in most of their day-to-day operations, including recruitment, propaganda, all those things. The most talked about point of criticism is, again, blowback, mostly focusing on the citizens in the target states that resent the use of technology, especially when there are attacks which create a lot of civilian damages. What's in some levels is called collateral damage, which is not the very best term to use, but that's part of it. And in many cases, especially when those attacks are happening, they blame the attackers on any kind of missing the target. And instead of focusing their anger, which is part of the objective of those kinds of aerial campaigns, instead of focusing the anger of the population and the terrorists, the anger is actually focused on the attackers. And that creates further radicalization, increase the local support for insurgents. It also damages the credibility of the local government. If that government is actually trying, the host government, trying to cooperate with the United States or with NATO for that matter, instead of having popular support for the government in Iraq that tries to cooperate with the United States fighting insurgents in Iraq, when there's an unsuccessful attack or attack that ends with civilian casualties, the blame also goes to the Iraqi government because you cooperate with the attackers. The last point, which I'm going to talk a little bit more today, is that it raises serious concerns regarding different violations of international laws, because in the vast majority of cases, those local host governments, they're not part of the mission briefing. So when the United States implements an attack against the Taliban in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, they only notify the local government once the attack has already took place or while the planes are already in the air. So there's not a lot of place for discussion here. So based on those kinds of counter arguments, I want to talk a little bit more about your opinion, about the public opinion of the use. Do we have it? No, something happened here. Oh, there it is. Sorry. About the use of. I think I lost one. There it is. The public use about the public opinion about using military drones. Overall, most of the data is collected, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes also, talk about more details about that. Specifically, when we talk about drones, most of the data is collected in American samples. And overall, research in that sense shows there is a strong support within the American public to the use of drones as a tool when it comes to conflicts, especially because they are a cost effectiveness compared to the alternative of using soldiers, what's called boots on the ground. And this is a relatively vast support which transcends party lines. Scholars also use experiments to try and add a little more specific types of information and still test for the opinion of the public. So I talked a little bit about the effects of emotion as a response to terrorism. When terrorism leads to high degrees of emotional reactions led by anger, then public support for the use of drones as a counterterrorism tool is actually much higher. However, and that comes back to the disadvantages of drones, when international law compliance entered this equation, whether we should use drones, yes or no, then there's a lot more variations. Studies that accounted also for international laws have shown that when the attacks are described as actions that violate international laws, then the extent of support from the public to the use of those tools is lower. Another area of research in that context is based on the fact that more and more countries are using drones. So that's the question of proliferation, which we have here in this slide. This is a drone developed by Israeli aerospace industry. So this is used in Israel. This is a drone used by Saudi Arabia, developed by the Chinese. and this is a drone used by the Indian military. So scholars have addressed those questions regarding proliferation, and they show that the overall increase around the globe in the extent of security threats led by threats from different militant groups, not just terrorists, overall militant groups, pushes state to acquire mostly the advanced and armed type of drones, and not the what's called the tactical, which is another type of drone, which is less common. The models also account and test for regime acquisition preferences. So they separate between different types of regime, and they show that while both democracies and autocracies try to obtain armed drones, their motivations are actually different. For democracies, the motivation for acquiring this type of drones is cost reduction in terms of human casualties, both for the military personnel as well as for the civilians in the target area. For dictators, the motivation to acquire those types of drones is mostly about having more central control over the use of force. So again, both types of countries try to acquire more of the armed types of that technology, but the motivation is different. Another way to apply this technology into discussions about theories of IR is thinking about that in the context of coercion. And the question is, how can we apply some of the basic theories of deterrence, coercion, compellence when we talk about tools such as drones? The focus in this case is on how this technology serves to make a more compelling or more credible types of weapons. So drones serve as a tool that enable the country to send a more credible signal. They have the advantages of being cost effectiveness, they're highly accurate, so that amplifies the coercive power of those states that have access and possess this weapon system. That's one way to integrate that technology into the literature or to the theories that we already have about military coercion. Others suggest or wonder what happens if we make drones a legitimate part of warfare, how that may lead to escalation. So does shooting down a drone lead to an escalation in a conflict? And the existing evidence we have thus far suggests that this is not the case. And one of the main reasons for that, at least what we came up until now, that we have now, is that because there's no loss of life, the shooting down of a drone does not include a loss of human life, so there's no risk of escalation. So that's the military technology of drones, which there's a lot of research on that, and there's a lot of work finding evidence for that regarding the motivation for countries as well as the public opinion in that sense. I want to talk about other types of technological advancement, even more developed. So one, for example, is artificial intelligence. That relates to the ability of computers and machines to complete tasks which previously thought to require human intelligence. There's two main types for that. Three, if you want to also count the Marvel types of artificial intelligence. But the two main types, one of them is what's called narrow AI, discrete algorithms designed to execute a specific tasks, such as classifying a type of image or playing a game. An example for that is what's called the AlphaGo, which is the algorithm developed by the firm DeepMind. It defeated the world's best Go players in 2016. I'm not familiar with this game so much, but it shows how much those kinds of tools can be powerful. The other type is what's called AGI, which stands for Artificial General Intelligence, and that involves machines that have the capabilities to innovate themselves, not just to execute a specific task, but they also do new tasks in new categories of activities. So they're expanding beyond a very specific task. Those type of technologies are very important for powerful states. They see the artificial intelligence as a critical tool in shaping the future of military warfare and IR in more general. Both China and the United States, for that matter, invest a lot in this domain. And their view is mostly that having expertise can provide an advantage and an important tool in enhancing their own power. In terms of the research, we're still very, very limited in terms of actually studying artificial intelligence in the context of theories of foreign policy and IR, because the tools themselves are still in early phases of development. There's some authors that attempt to apply the existing theories in IR and test how artificial intelligence can be integrated into those theories. For example, how does artificial intelligence matters for military innovation? If you're interested in those kinds of things, you can send me an email. I can try and I'll send you a couple of studies that address that. That's very recent work that tackles those kinds of questions. There are other types of what's called advanced technologies. There it is. And the introduction and expanded use of those kinds of technologies, especially when you think about not just technologies overall, but advanced weapon systems, we started from drones and moving to a more developed type of tool, which is what I'm going to talk about now, raised many interesting questions, including potential changes to the barriers of entry into war, concerns about civilian casualties, how does those advanced systems fit within international laws, and other types of questions. And what I'm talking about now is what's called AWS, which is the acronym for Advanced Weapon Systems. Those are even more advanced versions of technologies such as drones. And unlike the drones, they are not controlled from distance. And they operate, and that's how it relates a little bit to the topic I just finished talking about, which is the artificial intelligence. They operate without human intervention, especially when it comes to the tasks of selection and engagement of targets. So for example, we have the Phalanx air defense system, which is a dominant surface-to-air defense system on a lot of naval warfare. So the Israeli Navy has used that. The American Navy has used those systems. The way that those systems operate is under this white dome here, where there's a radar system, which is directed at a different area of the battlefield. And it works by itself to identify, acquire targets, and decides which of the aerial targets that it identifies is more threatening, and executes the counterattack, again, autonomously. That's part of the way that the Phalanx system operates. Another example is Israel's development of the Harpy, which is a loitering munition system that also attacks an air defense system. It also operates relatively autonomously without human intervention. Now, what I want to focus the discussion here about those weapons is not what type of weapons they are or why they were developed, but mostly about the public opinion and the way that the public views the use of those kinds of weapons. So overall, international institutions raise serious concerns about using those weapons, those types of weapons, the more advanced type, which have very low amount of human intervention, because those organizations suggest that the public opinion, the global public opinion, opposes using military tools which do not have or have very limited amount of human control. So what Horowitz does in this paper, this is one of the first papers that actually address those types of questions, is to test public views of using the AWS systems, or the AWS because systems is part of this acronym, based on the proposition that contextual factors also matter. So the arguments made by international organizations is mostly based on the fact that the public may oppose those systems considering normative concerns or legal concerns. But the public also concerns the utility of those weapons, and that may have effect on their opinion considering different conditions. So for example, when it comes to casualty aversion, advanced weapon systems may be more popular among those types of individuals that place more value on protecting military casualties and civilian lives. When it comes to military utility, so advanced weapon systems are more popular if they're more useful in achieving victory, however we define victory, which is a different question. And the third point is the idea of adversaries. Support for the use of those kinds of advanced systems is probably going to be higher if there are growing concerns and evidence that my rivals develop and use such weapons. And because we're in the earlier phases of understanding those kinds of dynamics, We can think about, well, those kinds of weapons are developed by the military-industrial complex. Why should the public opinion matters? Well, overall, we talked about how public opinion matters for policy overall, but more specifically to the context of those kinds of technologies. International laws consist of a lot of clauses that argue that the use of such weapons is not encouraged because the public does not support that, so the use of such weapons is illegal. So we should check whether the public actually have an opinion on that. There's a very limited amount of existing research on that, suggesting that the public is averse to the use of those technologies, mostly because of moral considerations, and that has an effect that is important for the policy perspective, because if it's immoral, the public does not support that, does politicians have justification to approve the use of those kinds of weapons? We should have more evidence to make more conclusive argument in that area. Lastly, NGOs, which are non-governmental organizations, also relies on those arguments that the public averse to that to put a lot of pressure on the military technology industry, which has an effect on the development of such technology. So we should know more about how public members, and that also translates to elites and political decision makers, what they actually think on the use of those kinds of weapons, considering all the motivations, not just normative, moral considerations and legal considerations. So the way that he does that is he tests those propositions using experiments focusing on the aspects of military utility. And I'm going to show you just some of his results. So what we have here is the proportion of respondents and their support for the different types of factors. So what can we learn from that? From a baseline standpoint, this is the red bars here. You see that still there's higher proportion of opposition to the use of this weapon. So before we integrate any kind of those military utility arguments, by default, individuals are less supportive of that. So there's 48% opposition to the use of those systems compared to 38% of support. What happens when we start including all kinds of more military utility arguments into those explanations? So first, the support when we describe those weapons as more effective and protecting US forces is much higher. This is this blue bar that you have over here, 61% support when we describe the systems as effective and protecting of human life, especially American forces. Even when they are described not necessarily as effective, but still they are described as protecting human lives, that's what we have here on this yellow bar, there's the relatively high degree of support, 48% of support. In additional tests that he runs, he shows that the results remain consistent when you control for the level of knowledge of those weapons, and knowledge is going to be a very powerful factor from now, that moment that we have in the lecture until we end, because we're going to talk about it in other contexts. But for those who are more understanding of the technical aspects of those kinds of technologies, the level of support is slightly lower than what we have here in this figure, but overall, there's not much differences. Also, he runs additional analysis accounting for the third argument that I presented in the previous slide about the adversary use. And he shows that when the rivals develop those tools, the extent of support for actually employing that is much higher, getting to somewhere between 60 and 70%. So that provides us evidence regarding the effects of different contextual, situational specific factors to the way that individuals perceive those weapons and how much they are supporting or objecting them. All right, let's move on to our next topic, which is cyber technology. So cyber technology is an area of research that has its origins way back in the 1990s. It's gotten a lot more attention over the last 10, 15 years. The main focus of the research is how computer technology and networks have been weaponized and part of international conflict. One of the most distinct features of cyber weapons is that it's not what we can call as the conventional instruments of war or conventional instruments of conflict. For example, some cyber attacks actually seem more fitting to what can be viewed as a criminal type of act. So a bank robbery based on hacking into the main system instead of actually engaging in physical robbery. Cyber is also very common in the world of intelligence warfare. will leverage those kinds of tools in order to steal information from either private companies targeting personal records of individuals or sensitive types of information, or targeting governments, national governments, also targeting this kind of sensitive information, or spreading, spreading propaganda. The last method in which cyber technology can be used is in a way similar to conventional types of tools, and that's attacks on military networks in order to shut them down or disable them, hack into air defense system to limit its operations. So that's used by this technology in a way that is similar in some levels to a conventional use of attacks, but using different types of weapons. One of the important aspects of the research when it comes to cyber technology and wars and conflicts is the question of whether cyber tools can create enough risks to be viewed as a game-changing instrument. There's a lot of political officials that view the attacks that Russia has implemented as part of its conflict with Estonia and Georgia in the end of the 2010s, in the beginning of the 2010s, to show that there's evidence that this risk exists, even though there's some research suggesting otherwise, that for those specific attacks by Russia against Estonia and Georgia, the use of cyber technology was complementary and didn't really have much of an effect on the battlefield. And a lot of this debate relates to the way we define cyber war, cyber conflict. If we use a narrow definition of the physical effects, considering computer-based attacks, then our measurement for the effects is problematic. How do we measure the effects when you look more specifically on what military type of attack and what of technology type of attacks are created? If we adopt a broader definition, involve all the actions in the digital world, it has applications on international conflict. It's another way to look at that. And that also has its own sets of challenges when it comes to measuring those kinds of effects. Overall, what we can establish on some level to argue is that cyber weapons have the potential to widen the effects of war beyond the battlefield. These attacks are fitting to what's called second order effects because there's relatively easier access to implement those tools, and the attacks create those effects beyond the battlefield. So for example, we can think about targeting the adversary's national computer network to create severe damages, not just in the military context, beyond that. We can also think about attacks in the economic area that also has implication for the conflict. So those are the different ways in which cyber technology can enhance the effects of conflicts beyond the specific military context. One of the main aspects of research on cyber technology relates to the attribution problem. So the attribution is an essential part of cyber technology, and that's the ability to execute attacks from distance and escape from being captured or being identified by the target, especially early on. And so this is a very prevalent problem when it comes to the applications of cyber technology when it comes to war. Now, despite all those potential risks, everything that I've talked about here, there's potential risk from applying cyber technology in the context of conflict. Most scholars do not view cyber as having a critical effect on warfare. Some of the recent studies tested the use of cyber technology in conflicts from the early 2000s all the way to 2014, show very limited use, mostly in low conflict and low intensity actions. And mostly those attacks, those kinds of applications of cyber technology did not lead to escalation. So if we don't have evidence that cyber weapons escalate conflict or have actual tangible effect when it comes to conventional war, where is cyber technology more powerful? We can think about the 2016 elections, the interference by Russia. Since then, we can also think about the potential or the alleged interference in 2018 and the discussion around potential interference in the 2020 elections, which we just finished. We're focusing more on, because we know more about the 2016 ones. So those actions at the time created a lot of confusion and distrust in the system of government in the United States, and that's a critical component for the stability of the democratic systems here in the US. If we don't trust the results because of the potential for interference by outside members that, in that case, use cyber technology, that's a very severe risk for the stability of a governing system. Cyber capabilities are also more likely to be relevant when it comes to espionage and intelligence. They can be used for economic activities and targeting soft types of targets. They can be political and economic instruments that complement all types of intelligence operations. So that's all those areas are where cyber tools, especially the way we stand today, research views cyber as more relevant, as more powerful in those types of areas of conflict. Now, one of the last point in this kind of introduction into cyber, when I'm talking about here, is to talk about an accepted perception, which is not entirely correct. In many ways, a lot of non-experts tend to suggest that it is very easy to execute cyber attacks and cause severe damages. And it's not very accurate to think that every person with basic computer connection and hacking skills can create a large, significant cyber attacks against a nation state or a big organization. Those attacks require expertise and very significant skills and knowledge, as well as having the operational capacity and the resources to execute those attacks in such larger scale. So this is an important thing to note before we go into the specific studies on cyber technology. The risks, the potential risk is there, but it's not that every person that has the ability to hack into their sister's Gmail account can crash down the American military. Let's put those things in perspective. All right, so cyber attacks overall has become more famous and prevalent over the last decade. The media began paying more attention to it with events such as the interference by Russia in the 2016 elections, and some of the famous breaches of data by private and public companies, such as the data breach in Uber, in other areas. In the American government, there's a couple of data breaches, significant data breaches. Here we have some evidence regarding the potential economic cost of those kinds of breaches. And one of the important aspects of those incidents relates to what's called the user error problem. Error made by the computer users, which serve as a driver to making those kinds of attacks more successful and more costly. In other words, if we, the users, are able to engage in safer online practices, we can make those attacks a lot less severe. Because this human failure to engage in safer online practices is very important, exactly because cyber attackers focus on those weaknesses and exploit that in order to spread and create as much damage as possible. And research in that sense suggests that one of the central reasons for why we engage in such a negligent type of behavior relates to low levels of knowledge. We do not fully understand the risks of a cyber attack, and we don't understand what are the necessary practices to prevent those damages. And why is that? Overall, the public citizens do not view attacks that focus on data breaches as too risky. They are perceived as less common. They do not view as too catastrophic. They don't have any kind of personal effect on me, and they're more controllable compared to kind of a Pearl Harbor or physical type of attack. There's no evidence for cyber Pearl Harbor. So to explore a little bit more deeper those arguments, I want to talk about this research by Kostyuk and Wayne from it came out a couple of months ago. And they test public views of cyber threat using a survey experiments. They focus also on the idea of a personal threat. There's the fact that you may be the victim of a cyber attack by any kind of organization is more likely to lead you to alter your behavior and to act in a way which is safer. And they also account for different types of potential government actions in response to that. So what do they show? First of all, similar to the research that we know already, the respondents in their survey fit with other research showing relatively low level of knowledge and understanding of cyber threat. Even though a lot of people are using computers, they don't necessarily understand those risks. They also show that when the personal stake is part of this equation, then there's higher levels of concern. So what we have here in those figures, so those are the size of the effects. Everything above the zero is a positive effect. Everything that crosses the zero, of course, is a non-effect. So what we see here, that when the threat is personal, when I'm likely to be the victim of a cyber attack, then I'm more concerned about a civilian cyber attack. And I rank my personal risk from being a victim of cyber attack is higher compared to when the threat is just national. There's overall discussion about the potential of a cyber attack against the American network system. Then those concerns are not really being taken seriously by members of the public. They show that the behavior when it comes to a personal threat is actually inconsistent, because facing those kinds of threats, facing the possibility that I'm going to be a victim of a cyber attack, those respondents in their surveys express the willingness to alter their behavior and to act more safely. But in reality, and they tested that, there's no evidence for that, and the respondents failed to engage in safer practices. The way that they do that is that they ran the experiment, and one day after the experiment, they sent a bogus cyber email to those respondents to see whether they will actually open that email or not. Those was the emails that you get a lot to your inbox or to your junk mail, saying, hey, I watched your lecture, I watched your paper, it seems very interesting, please reply to me so we can talk about that. That's a very textbook type of what's called a phishing attack by cyber perpetrators. And what they showed in their research is a lot of the people that they send those emails to actually answer to those emails. So there is expressed willingness to change your behavior based on what you read in the survey, but you don't actually do that. Lastly, they also tested about support for different types of policy options. And this is the types of policies they talked about. The type of figure that we have here is something which I haven't shown you yet. This is what's called a box plot. Those lines here represent the average level of response, and the lower and upper bounds represent the 25th percentile type of response and the 75th percentile of the values. So what we see that overall there's relatively lower level of support when it comes to using to retaliate and create deterrence after a cyber attack. There's a little bit more support when it comes to increasing knowledge with education and other types of policies, but we don't see much of differences, and overall there's not a lot of support for the different types of policy options in their data. So the bottom line that we have here for this research is that people do not pay a lot of attention and do not view cyber attacks as a significant type of threat. Before going to the last part of the discussion today, I'll stop for today's attendance word. The attendance word for today is the word almost, mostly because we're almost done with the semester, but almost will be the attendance word for today. The last subtopic that I want to talk about is going to fit into the overall topic of cyber. It actually is based on research that I'm part of right now, research project which I'm working on right now, and that integrates the idea of cyber attacks and public opinion with the context of terrorism. Do cyber attacks by terrorists are seen as a threat? Is the public aware of this type of threat? Is it really a concern for the public? We know that for cyber attacks, from the research we have so far, it's not really concerning. But because maybe I'm, as an individual, not too worried about China trying to attack my own laptop. But maybe terrorists will try to focus on College Station because it's a college town. Am I concerned about that? So the point is that we know already that the public is not too concerned about cyber attacks, the public is not really happy to accept any kind of policies that require substantial investment in order to protect us from cyber attacks. That's what these existing researchers told us. But check this Gallup poll, not from too long ago. It's February 2018, so it's almost 3 years ago. And look at the values for viewing critical threat. International terrorism is 75% critical threat, but cyber terrorism is 81%. It's not even cyber attacks by China or Russia or any other country. It's cyber terrorism. It's terrorists using cyber tools as part of their attack, and the degree of viewing that as a critical threat is very, very high. So how can you explain this contrast between the public and most research tell us we don't really care about cyber attacks, but when we ask them, how much do you view cyber attack by terrorists as a critical threat, 81% will say that. So what we do in our research is focusing on the public opinion surveys themselves and the issues of cyber as a complex issue to understand. What we suggest is that when we collect public opinion data in those kinds of surveys, we need to account for more specific types of elements. So what we argue is that those surveys, because the way that they are structured, they ask the questions in a much more abstract and general way. So you have, how concerned are you of the threat of terrorism, of the threat of whatever that is? What is the most important types of threat? Look at the way that the question is described in this survey. I'm going to read you a list of possible threats. For each one, please tell me if you see this as a critical threat. So this is a very general way to ask those questions. What we suggest is that we need to unpack those perceptions and look at more specific elements such as the likelihood or the cost, this is a more clear element. If I'm going to ask you what's the likelihood of certain type of threat materializes, it's going to be much easier for you to come up with a very clear answer than just asking you, how concerned are you of this threat? So we differentiate between likelihood of terrorism, conventional terrorism, the likelihood of cyber terrorism, and similarly also when it comes to the costs. We suggest that the likelihood, that the way that the public is going to respond and view likelihood is that cyber attack is going to be very, very unlikely, and conventional attack is going to be very, very likely. We know that there's a lot more conventional attacks, even though a lot of them are not in the United States. The media tells us about the prevalence of terrorism overall in the world. On the other hand, there's not a lot of discussion when it comes to cyber terrorism. The evidence for actual attacks by cyber terrorists is actually non-existent. There's no attacks by cyber terrorists. So the likelihood is going to be very, very low. But when we think about the cost, the potential damages for that, cyber attack is going to be perceived as a lot more costly because of that uncertainty, because we don't know what the attacks may be. So most of the discussion that do exist in the media is on the potential risk and the potential for a cyber Pearl Harbor, for terrorists attacking the grid, the power grid networks of New York City, shutting down electricity in New York City, and then all hospitals are being completely become irrelevant in that case, just as an example. On the other hand, when we think about the cost from a conventional terrorism, there are costs, but they are very, very low. Think about all the points that I made when we talked about terrorism last week. The effect that there's not a lot of attacks in the West, even when there are attacks in the West, the extent of casualties is very, very low. So yes, there's a lot of terrorism overall in the world, but the cost, especially when you think about our more constrained area for us here living in the United States or in the West, is very, very low. And we argue that those differences between likelihood and cost when it comes to cyber versus conventional terrorism is based on the exposure to the threat. Okay, again, so there's not exposure to cyber terrorism, there's a little bit more exposure to terrorism, the way that the media frame those threats, and our basic understanding from a technological standpoint, what does the cyber terror attacks means. So what we do in that research, based on those arguments, we compare cyber terrorism threats to conventional terrorism, and we looked at those different attributes. We look at likelihood and costs, and we also account for concern, which is the more general type. So what we have here in this middle figure is the levels of concern from attack by conventional attack or a cyber attack. And as you can see, that reflects pretty nicely to the Gallup pool that I showed you earlier, that those are very, very close. There's not much difference between them. But what happens when we go and we looked more specifically on those different attributes such as likelihood. Conventional is a lot higher compared to a cyber attack, because we don't have evidence for a cyber attack by terrorists. We have a lot of evidence for conventional attack by terrorists, even if not all of them are in the United States. Especially when we focus on comparing those two methods, and this is the question that we're asking, those are the differences we view. And look what happened when we look at casualties, which is the cost attribute. The costs of a cyber attack are perceived as much, much higher compared to the cost from a conventional terrorism attack, as we expected. So if we integrate those two attributes into one measure, which is essentially what we argue that happens in those general public opinion polls, such as the concern, we get actually almost no difference between those two types of terrorism. And that's the argument that we made here. When we're trying to estimate or to assess the public opinion of such complex issues, such as the use of cyber technology by terrorists, which we have almost no evidence for at the moment, we have to account for much more specific type of elements in the way that we ask those questions. Because the level of knowledge that we have as members of the public regarding the potential risks or the implications of a cyber attack is very, very limited. Okay, so that's, if you want to read a little bit more, the research that I have, what I showed you here, this is still not published. It's only in advanced stages of being published, so it's not published out yet. If you want to read about stuff that has already been published over the last year, 2 years about that, there's a lot of research. You're more than welcome to use those or search by yourselves. One last thing, I'll encourage you once again, if you have some difficulty, if you encounter some difficulties with your final project, then come talk to me during office hours. And with that, I'll be done for today, and I will see you on Thursday for our last meeting of the semester. See you, everyone.